All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today we have Joshua Moufawad-Paul to discuss his recently published piece, The Immanent Garrison, Settlerism as Institutionalized Ideology, which is in the second issue of Material, which is a Marxist-Leninist-Maoist journal for contending schools of revolutionary thought. You can find it there's a link in the show notes, first of all, but it's a journal that's put out by Foreign Languages Press, which we've talked about before on this platform, but just an excellent press that puts out, they have a foundation series, right, that you can buy affordable copies of a whole gamut of revolutionary Marxist theory, some of the, early works, foundational works, obviously, due to the name. um, and then there's New Roads, and then there's one, and I can't remember the one around this, but I'm sure, Josh will remind me when he gets on here, but there's one that, shares, I think it's like Tales from the Front, something like that, but it's, stories from, like, journalists, that went to China during the revolutionary period or went to Soviet Union during the revolutionary period, right? And shared the things that they were seeing, the types of transformations, the contradictions, right? So there's more, right? I think I said New Roads. There's other things, and I'm sure we can talk a little bit with Josh about those. But anyways, I just really encourage people to check it out. It's one of the um, best presses that's publishing stuff within, a line of revolutionary science that you can find. And there aren't that many presses. There's a few, there's more now, which is great. That are really focused specifically on that, like a lot of the left-wing presses are more diverse and diffuse kind of ideologically and include stuff that's not necessarily directly in the Marxist tradition or Marxist-Leninist tradition or Maoist tradition, but stuff that's outside of that. And so I think that stuff is interesting and important, and I enjoy reading it as well too. But I definitely think it's important for people to have those foundations. So and to read people who are thinking with revolutionary theory today, right? Which is what Material is about as a journal. So um, Joshua Moufawad-Paul is a co-editor of Material. So he's on the editorial board. He is a professor and an author. His books include the Communist Necessity, Continuity and Rupture, Philosophy in the Maoist Terrain, Austerity Apparatus, Methods Devour Themselves, which he co-authors, Demarcation and Demystification, Critique of Maoist Reason, and Politics in Command, Taxonomy of Economism, which we have an episode on that's linked in the show notes too. It's an audio episode we did a year or two ago. And then I think a year ago, and then 2 years ago, we did a two-part one on the book on necro-capitalism, which y'all can see behind me, which is a plague journal, which was something that Josh and some of his comrades wrote during the height of the pandemic, right? The pandemic that never really goes away because it just keeps coming back. So anyways, I just wanted to offer that by way of introduction, say good morning to folks. Yeah, people are correcting me in the chat already. Great. Maoism and yeah, colorful classics. That's one that I did not mention too, in terms of the series that Foreign Languages Press put out. So that said, of course, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and share it, right? Share it with your comrades, share it with your friends, share it with people that might be interested. Today, we're going to have a conversation that I think will be interesting to folks, regardless of their, orientation politically, because we're going to be talking about settlerism and settler colonialism. And thinking about this, obviously, we have to think about it in the context of the genocidal counterinsurgent war in Palestine, right? An occupied Palestine. But we also have to think about it in the context, which is more difficult for a lot of us to think about it in the context of North America, so-called, right? Turtle Island, Australia, New Zealand, right? Other settler colonial places. Africa has a lot of countries that have a lot of settlers in them as well. And so, this is an important analytic and concept for us to think about in a revolutionary way. And so I'm really excited to have JMP here to help us out with that. So JMP, welcome to the show. It's good to be in conversation with you again.
Hey, great to be here.
Yep. So let me see. So let me pull up while I'm pulling up the questions. Is there anything you want to offer just about material and about foreign languages press? Just
Yeah,
as
I mean, I think in some of the questions when I was looking over it, I talk about it a bit there as well. So
okay.
we can just get into it, and I can
Yep.
give a little rundown as organically part of what I'm talking about.
Right on, right on. So the piece that we're here to talk about, as I mentioned, is in the latest issue of Material, which just came out a few weeks ago. I reached out to you like right away. And so to start, say a little bit about Material itself and then share a bit of history behind this specific essay, which you mentioned to me, something that you've been working on for a while and has an interesting history of not being published with another journal. And so say a little bit about that before it, came out on Material.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, Material, right? I mean, Material is a magazine that, as you mentioned, Foreign Languages Press started, and they invited me to be part of the editorial committee. And also there's like other people that are involved in, so the editorial committee is just the editors of Foreign Languages Press and myself, but also there's an advisory board that consists of, people like Stephen Osuna, who you've had on the show before. And then, folks like Ajit, who's, an important Indian revolutionary, Julie de Lima, who's, one of the co-founders of the current Communist Party of the Philippines, and, works in the fronts, international fronts. And there's others like that on the advisory board. But the basic idea of Material is that we wanted it to be this kind of united front struggle journal. So while myself and the other people running it are Maoists, right? The whole idea was we wanted to kind of invite folks from a number of other adjacent and non-antagonistic revolutionary traditions to submit quality essays, fiction, poetry. We kind of see it as an art, right? We see it as also having a cultural front. I mean, if you see this issue has like, a short story in it, poetry, and art as well around the essays. We kind of had that let 100 flowers blossom kind of attitude towards it. I mean, obviously, we have certain boundaries, right? We're not going to publish, reactionaries or people, who are, claim they're communists but have completely chauvinist tendencies, right? We have certain kind of red lines we won't cross, but there's so much in kind of the broad revolutionary tradition, not just Maoist. I'm a Maoist, but other people have, traditions that are really important and that have non-antagonistic positions towards us, and that we can all learn from each other. So that being said, we also kind of wanted to have this quality, like we wanted it to not just be, like anything goes, even in terms of quality, not just politics. So we have a progressive kind of peer review process, because it's not like fully academic gatekeeping, people with egos playing, shutting young scholars out, or young revolutionaries who have produced scholarship outside of academia out. Usually we seek out peer reviewers when we come up with these kind of essays that we aren't qualified to like comment on, who have both the expertise but also have good politics and aren't assholes to look over the articles as well. So the first issue of Material, because the one we're talking about is the second, but the first issue came out in October last year, and it came out the same week of October 7th, right? So it was kind of eclipsed by the war on Gaza, for good reason, because all of our eyes were there. We're dealing with the beginning of what would become a major genocidal war. And although our first issue had some great articles in it on a variety of different topics, right, and that spoke to problems of facing the left in general, it didn't have anything specific to say about that moment. So it was kind of overlooked, right? I mean, people liked it, but didn't make the big splash that we wanted it to. And that's fine, right? But it did cause us to want to make the second issue actually about settler colonialism and struggles for national self-determination. And that's the issue that we're dealing with today. And I think it's a really, really good issue. We spent a lot of time working on getting the content and editing, and we are all of us are happy with it. And as for my article, and I'll move to the thing you said about my article, right? The Immanent Garrison. Originally, I had no plans to submit it to a magazine I was working on. The other editors really wanted me to. But this was originally written years ago, right? At the beginning of the lockdown, and submitted to the Journal of Settler Colonial Studies. It took a while for it even to go to peer review. I think it took over a year, because right after I submitted it to that journal, its editorial committee had left. So when they finally got to peer review, they were also looking for a new editorial committee. And interestingly enough, when the interim supervisor let me know about this delay, she also asked if I would be interested in putting together a proposal for a new editorial committee she could take to the board. Others have been asked as well. So while also this article is going through peer review, I put together a proposal. I contacted people from all over the world, a number of them from colonized nations, both in North America and abroad. But neither the article nor the editorial committee proposal were accepted. So the reason the article was rejected was because one of the peer reviewers had a serious disagreement with my theoretical apparatus. So while I dealt with the suggestions of the other two peer reviewers, I kind of refused to deal with the third reviewer's suggestions. I wrote a defense of why I wouldn't, because I found it was completely would change the entire focus of the paper. I also found they wanted me to use an author I found quite chauvinistic, and who I had actually critiqued severely somewhere else. And so to use this guy would be inconsistent and it would undermine my paper, right? And for some reason, because I wouldn't do that, I guess the one person had the power to block it, so it wasn't accepted. I will say that the interim editor was kind of apologetic about that. And to her credit, and to be super fair to her, she actually wrote a lot more suggestions to make the paper better so I could submit it elsewhere, something she didn't have to do. And then as for the proposal for the editorial committee, the reason why that was not, I have no idea why it wasn't accepted. I got no one told us or anything why it was rejected. I just know they chose to go with someone else. And the other committee they chose to go with, I don't know if people remember this, but back, I think in the fall of 2023, that editorial board wrote this editorial about not seeing Israel as a colonizing power and buying into a lot of the Israeli propaganda about the war in Gaza. And it tended to make the journal look pretty ignorant for people who study colonialism from an anti-colonial perspective. So all I can say is that the committee I had put together would have never written such a collaborationist editorial. And so maybe in hindsight, I'm glad this article wasn't published by Settler Colonial Studies. Anyways, just to wrap this story up, it underwent a number of transformations since then. I was invited to give a workshop around a working paper for a political theory class at the University of Connecticut, and that was at the end of 2023. And so I edited this again, made it, updated it to connect it to stuff that was going on in Gaza. I sent it to the workshop so it could be read ahead of time, and then I could give a small presentation, and we discussed it, and the folks there gave some great input. And then after that, I was bugged by Mathieu and Dee at Foreign Languages Press to submit it to the material issue we were working on, which I didn't want to do at first because I was an editor as well, but they were insistent, and I guess for good reason. It really did fit the subject material. Also, I got really good editing from them and the crew that's around FLP that made it stronger, although unexpectedly longer.
Right on. And I'll just say anecdotally too, we do have another episode coming that was already recorded that is an audio episode, and those always take us a little longer to get out these days, but with Danny Marabat on social investigation and class analysis, on which comes from the first issue of material. So I also underscored that there's some really good work in that issue as well, even though I was in the same boat of, I remember when it came out and I was like, oh, this is cool. And I think Stephen Osuna probably sent it to me, and I didn't read it at all at the time because I was like, I was too engaged and invested in how do I intervene, or what should be our interventions really around what was going on in Palestine, right? And so so anyways, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the new issue focused on national liberation. So again, as you said, this piece it began, you wrote it during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you start this piece by talking about the response among the settler population to the social distancing and masking requirements during COVID-19 during those early stages. So do you want to begin by just laying out, just kind of reminding people, because I'm sure as you talk about it, people will be like, "Oh yeah, I remember that. I remember that." But it's a, it's some of these things we don't keep at top of mind, and so talk about some of the things that you were talking about early on during that period, and point them towards some of the specific instances that help us to see the dynamics you're looking to explain in the text.
Yeah, I mean it shows you how old that article was when it started, because the frame that it starts with is like back in April 2020. um, and and that was when, in April 2020, when I was originally writing this, that's when an armed right-wing militia marched into a government building in Michigan to demand that lockdown measures ended, and they weren't met with a violent response from the police, as would have happened if it was like a radical left-wing group, or as happened to say the Black Panthers when when they did things like that. Instead, they were allowed to just do their thing, and then they were peacefully disbanded. And there was and this is of course before that, the January 2021, which most people remember more than this, right? So there was a discussion, I think almost like right when it was happening or right after it happened, on social media about it. And I seem to recall that you were part of that discussion as well, just on these kind of stream. There was like folks were saying that they were let off because of white privilege. And I remember you and myself and some others like saying that kind of rubric, it more explains a symptom, right? It doesn't really explain what's going on this material, concrete level. Like, yeah, there's privileges generated by something, but what's actually going on there? There's something deeper. And I was already writing parts of this paper on settler subjectivity at the time, and I was like, oh, this is a good concrete way to approach the question of settlerism. And then so that was April 2020, but as we know, there's things happened since then, right? They're very similar to this. So I mentioned earlier the whole Capitol building so-called insurrection in the following January of 2021. Even though it was condemned by liberals, it was not violently dispersed, right? I mean, it's not. They would have reacted completely different if it had different political content. And then there was the convoy in Canada. I don't know how many of your listeners are from Canada or aware of that, but there was this thing in Canada that happened where a bunch of reaction. They called it a trucking convoy, but a lot of these people weren't truckers, or some of them were petty bourgeois small business owners who owned trucking companies. But it was really just a bunch of reactionaries who drove to Ottawa, and they occupied the entire downtown around the center of government. They kind of terrorized the local population, were complete typical kind of Yahoo assholes. And they were largely allowed to do so for a month by the police and security forces, even though the Trudeau government invoked state of emergency measures. The government invoked these state of emergency measures, but aside from them invoking it, and later on some people being charged because of it, there was no violent collision. Police just let them do what they want, right? So in any case, and those are just some iconic examples, but we had a whole host of reactionary would-be insurrectionists whose identity was tied strongly to being real American or real Canadian, which was a settler vision of these entities, getting angry that they couldn't do what they wanted during lockdown, suddenly feeling these limits to their autonomy that they otherwise took for granted, basically throwing tantrums. But the state allowed them to throw these tantrums, even if these tantrums were them walking around with weapons and harassing people. And the only reply were kind of these largely metaphorical slaps on the wrist. So if you think now, right, of the ways in which people protesting for the end of genocide in Palestine are being treated by the pigs, right, compared to the way these protests were treated, you can see a vast difference. In the essay, since it was before the encampments, right, I talked about the contrast between these right-wing protests and, say, the George Floyd protests or the Wet'suwet'en barricades, and the difference of treatment, right? And what I was kind of looking at here is the continuum in the settler capitalist state between these right-wing paramilitary ventures and the official security forces. And I wanted to explore that, among other things.
Right on. Yeah, it's funny that you remember that. I do remember talking about that discussion of white privilege, and talking about the history of which we'll get into, I'm sure, as part of this. But settler garrisons. And as you know, you work with some of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's work in this piece, and she's very influential in my understanding and sharing that history of, you know, the relationship between settlers and the policing genocide. She uses the term extirpation a lot of indigenous people. And so, yeah, I, it's funny that you remember that, but I do remember that. Uh, so you write, there's a phrase you use that I want to just unpack, because I think it will help us to understand a lot of the kind of terms that you're working with and the kind of analysis that you're bringing in this piece. So you write, settlerism is the institutional ideology of the settler garrison. So let's just break that down a little bit. Talk a little bit about what settler garrisons are, what settlerism is, and how and why you know, an ideology becomes institutionalized.
Well, I mean, so we can begin historically, right? Settler garrisons were real things in the period of conquest. Basically, as I point out in reference to a number of historians, you know, you mentioned Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, she's a great starting place, but other people as well. When spaces that would eventually become the US or Canada were initially being colonized, garrisons were established in the heart of so-called Indian country. And these garrisons were villages of militarized life, antagonistic to the existence of the people that were being conquered. The garrisons were kind of like they're structured in a way that every person who was part of them was conceived of as a potential combatant aimed against the existence of the surrounding forms of life. So, for example, again, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talks about how these irregular units were in fact a regular part of colonizing existence and seen as adjuncts to the so-called official army in colonial conquest. So that's where you get this initial kind of continuity between the paramilitary and military, right, in a very concrete sense in the days of conquest. But we don't have to go that far back in history because to look at these concrete garrison formations, because the most recent example of settler colonialism, and that's the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948, has been maintaining these kinds of garrisons in the so-called occupied territories right up until the present. The settlements in Gaza and the West Bank, which are exactly like the settler garrisons employed in the conquest of the Americas, are you know, these enclaves where it's a paramilitary, militarized life. So, you know, a lot of the discourse around the October 7th attacks, like that was put out by the liberal media, completely obliterated this reality, like not knowing what these settlements are. It's like, oh, these settlements were attacked. These settlements are garrisons, right? They have a military dimension. And in fact, a lot of people that were in them are people that have been, you know, also are recruits or would be recruits or have served time on the IOF as well. So my point in the essay, then, to move on from this concrete garrison, is that this kind of garrison mentality, this settler militarized life, does not simply go away once conquest is completed. It remains in an ideological form that generates particular subjects for as long as colonized people also remain and struggle for their self-determination. And as many people will know, I quote him too, I borrowed the term settlerism from Sakai's controversial book, Settlers. You know, it's controversial text because its ultimate argument is that the white working class is thoroughly a parasitic labor aristocracy in settler colonial context. And it's also one of the hallowed texts of the so-called Maoist third worldism strain of Maoism. And, you know, while I don't always agree with Sakai or every point of that book, let alone Maoist third worldism, I think it's a very important movement text that makes a lot of necessary points and generally pisses off the people who should be pissed off. So while you know, it's just, I don't agree 100% with most radical theory I read. I don't think anyone does, but there's always good things to be retained in our reading of this stuff, especially movement texts that we can learn from. And I think Sakai's attempt to think the way class composition functions in colonial context should be taken seriously. So the point here is that in settler colonial contexts, there is a settlerist ideology, a settlerism that affects people born into these contexts and who grow up having a number of material privileges based on the history of settler colonialism. Again, these privileges are symptomatic. They're the result of being settlers, of becoming settler subjects, which is a kind of cross-class alliance that exists in these spaces, what Du Bois called the psychological wage. Settlerism becomes an ideology and because it is institutionalized. Ideologies that possess any kind of strength are such because they have reached an institutional level. And this, comes out of my understanding of ideology from kind of the Gramscian Althusserian analysis of ideology. They're ideologically compelling because they have become, through this institutionalization, common sense, right? This kind of, they masquerade as common sense. They are ideologically effective because they have become part of like ideological state apparatuses. Marx and Engels spoke of ideology as possessing a material force, right? That can come to possess a material force. And it possesses this material force when it is institutionalized and given such a force by the state apparatuses processes over a period of time. So when I said settlerism was the institutionalized ideology of the colonial garrison, what I was saying was that the actual settler garrison of conquest, even when it disappears as a concrete structure, right? And that'd be like, situations of colonialism that, we're talking about 500 years since conquest. It doesn't really disappear in more recent ones. But even when it disappears as a concrete structure, it doesn't truly disappear from consciousness. That kind of garrison ideology, that's where the settler is against the to be colonized surround, it becomes immanent, like just a state of reality, right? It becomes part of settler colonial life even after conquest. It becomes the way people who live in these settler capitalist formations can be socialized to see existence altogether, the way they think about those colonized people who remain and struggle for self-determination, the way it still ties paramilitaries and official security apparatuses together ideologically. But to be clear here, it's it's not totalizing, right? It functions like the way bourgeois ideology functions in these kind of settler colonial contexts. It's powerful, it's terribly compelling. It's part of the ruling ideas of the ruling class that can generate and mobilize common sense subject positions. When you're born into a settler colonial social formation, especially if you come from a social position that benefits in some way from colonialism, you were taught that this is a good thing. There's different ways you can be taught this, different kind of political positions. You could be taught that the settler colonial state over time became this great civilizing mission, even if it committed some lamentable mistakes in the past. Or, it can be taught this a seemingly more left-wing one, that if certain aspects of the state need to go, we need to have socialism or social democracy. The colonial past, because it is seen as remaining in the past, it doesn't even need to be addressed, right? It's that a whole idea, it's treated as an event, not a structure, referring to that Patrick Wolf quote. And of course, you get the most reactionary position that, a lot of, the hard right takes, is that colonialism and white civilization is good, is better than anything else, right? But all of these subject positions, they're on a continuum, and they form interlocking grids of settlerism and are part of becoming a conscious person in a settler colonial context. They can be rejected, obviously. Like I wouldn't, I come from a settler background, right? And obviously I'm writing this piece. And so it's like, these ideologies aren't totalizing. But other dominant ideologies can be rejected as well. It doesn't mean that they aren't dominant and they don't define what is seen as common sense in reality. And settlerism is a dominant ideology in settler colonial contexts. It forms kind of one of the main ways people in these contexts are taught to see the world. And this, I think we can all think about examples of this. If you ever been into a public school system or grew up in it, you're going to see examples of how they teach the history, the colonial history of your society, right? And that history it can be taught in a variety of ways. Like when I was young, which I don't, I'm in my 40s, but so the way it was taught in public school then was closer to a more reactionary one. There might have been some liberal elements thrown in there, but now we have maybe people are lamenting the what happened. They don't use the term genocide usually in these textbooks, or rarely see it, right? But people are lamenting the colonial past, but it's still like rah whatever patriotism, it's important to celebrate the country or find a way to celebrate it within it, right? And that's a very settler consciousness that you're taught from the moment you go into an institution like the public school.
Yeah, right on. And I don't know. I mean, the next question was kind of related to something that you just talked about. So I don't know if you have more points that you want to make along this line. But I was gonna say sort of like one of the counterpoints that people would say, right, is the garrison was this necessary formation for the settler colonial project at a specific period in time, right? Again, so this is kind of what you're talking about in terms of the event, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
a periodization, right, of settler colonialism of during this period, this is what happened, and then, it became more inclusive, et cetera, right? And so eventually in this argument, right, you would say, okay, the land was taken, but at a certain point, then you institutionalize things like the police and the National Guard, and so the settlers don't have to take on this garrison mentality, right? The quote unquote well regulated militia, right, that we find in the Second Amendment in the United States that Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz also talks about, right, is not really necessary, to the maintenance of the kind of status quo. And so folks might argue that at that point the ideology begins to recede, right, as it is seen as less necessary. And so um I don't know if there's further points you wanted to talk about with that, of kind of how you address that point and maybe some examples of where we can see settler ideology reemerge.
Yeah, I do think it's important maybe to dig into it a bit. Like this is I mentioned just kind of theoretical stuff and about event, not a structure. I think it's important to actually address this in more detail. I mean, the reality is that if people survive colonial conquest and are still resisting, then the question kind of becomes moot here about it was in the past and not now, right? The fact is that colonized people did survive and continue to resist, and so colonialism is, as we've just been discussing from that the Patrick Wolf quote, it's this ongoing process, and so these settler subjectivities are continuously generated in response to survival and resistance. I mean, other radical subjectivities are generated as well. As an aside, I have a book that is like going to be coming out. I don't know how soon, but it's it's in the editorial process with Roman and Littlefield about kind of subjectivities, right? Radical and non-radical subjectivities in the history of the subject. Side point, self-promotion. Anyhow, so back to this question. While these settler colonial projects possess hegemony to the point of becoming, in some cases, very powerful imperialist states, it's the case that they still have to deal with their so-called, internal colonies, it's often called, even though they're totally external in theoretical and political ways, where those who have survived conquest because they fought to survive are still fighting. So the colonizers did not fully take the land. They did not fully eradicate the challenges and are still fighting a war to complete conquest internally while also fighting their imperialist wars elsewhere. Settler ideology always reemerges, this kind of garrison life always emerges when the colonized mobilize for their self-determination. And I give an example in the article that, there's more examples, but this I think is like, very, paradigmatic example for Canada where I am, right? And that is what's called, known as kind of the Ganasatagi resistance to Oka's incursion on its territory. So Ganasatagi is a Mohawk community, Iroquois Mohawk community around what we call Quebec area. It's in Quebec, and it borders the town that borders it is called Oka, and this is usually referred to in Canadian history as the Oka standoff. So in Ganasatagi is one of these kind of keystone moments of Indigenous resistance in Canada in the 20th century. Oka decided they were going to annex part of Ganasatagi to expand a golf course from 9 holes to 18 holes. And that expansion would mean that they were just going to completely obliterate Ganasatagi's community cemetery. Like just get rid of the headstones, exhume the bodies, just do that. So of course, this isn't acceptable. And this is where, the community of Ganasatagi put up barricades, they armed themselves, and eventually it resulted in a standoff with the Canadian Army. But before that standoff came, all of the, well, not all, but you say the vast majority of people in Oka, the surrounding thing, who had known these people as their neighbors, were good liberal citizens, they all became these raving reactionaries overnight. Again, I shouldn't say all, there was people that did that, but you see this long, total, like this very dominant attitude of reaction, of most right-wing reaction, right? They were burning Mohawk effigies and chanting savages, right? When the community was trying to get its elders and children out of the war zone, they lined up on the highways and were throwing rocks at them, right? Rocks at the cars. It's just this the most gross kind of emergence of colonial racism, right? And so that kind of shows how this, that settlerist ideology, that immanent garrison, it's always there, and it emerges in these paramilitary forms when there are these moments of contact of colonial resistance. And we can think of other examples. We saw similar things happen with Wet'suwet'en recently. The same things happened in like Six Nations close to where I was in the early 2000s, where even like the community of Caledonia, suddenly the KKK was there, getting involved with them to police the borders with the Six Nations resistance.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I mean, there's a question I'll save for the maybe after we finish through these questions, we'll have time for some follow-ups and stuff like that. But also, folks, if you have questions in the chat, feel free to drop them in there and just put a Q or a question there so I can flag it as we go through, and we'll try to get to some of those as well. So there's another critique here, which is what you call left wing, and you of course put left wing in quotes because you're saying it's not really left wing, right? But it presents itself as such. Left wing settlerism. So can you say a little bit more specifically about what you're identifying or thinking about in terms of left wing settlerism, and what do you see as some versions of this?
Well, I mean, I think the large point behind this is that settlerism ideologically affects those who even see themselves as part of the left, which is kind of the importance of thinking of it as this dominant ideology. So even the traditional left in settler colonial context can be deformed by this Garrison ideology. I mean, you saw this is like historical, right? I mean, you could think back to like Algeria, right? And the Communist Party in Algeria, which is, for the French colonizers and their position when the FLN was resisting. And this is kind of something that happens all the time. And this is why you have people who see themselves as being left-wing also having, a problematic relationship to the analysis of settler colonialism. Sometimes they may have no problem with it, or they might see that it's not an issue. Again, something that happened in the past. I mean, there's these extreme variants that, I know that we've talked about them before. I think we talked about them back when we were doing the necrocapitalism talk too, about this kind of patriotic socialism and mega communism. Those ideologies appearing right now. But that's not really what I'm talking about, because those are arguably just reactionary politics dressed up to look socialist and communist, like third positionism or national Bolshevism, right? There's something that is more fascist about them, but they use these kind of like communist signifiers to almost like try to capture people that are interested in communism into a fascist project, kind of like National Socialism. The term socialism is connected to that. So that's not really what I'm looking at, although it's worth trashing them and saying how bad they are. And maybe people that have a left-wing consciousness get drawn to them because of the settlerism consciousness they also have. But I think there's the more important fact that the left in settler capitalist contexts has had a hard time with reckoning with colonialism. A lot of communist projects within these settler colonial contexts haven't really thought their way through this. And that's why you have this history of traditional communist parties having very little to say about decolonization, since they still base themselves on working class projects that take the colonial state as fundamental, and the problems of colonial racism is seen more as a civil rights problem rather than a national self-determination problem. That's, the Communist Party of Canada, which is, the dominant revisionist party in Canada. That's its analysis of it. It doesn't have any notion of decolonization, national self-determination, any form of land back or anything like that. In fact, it rejects that. It would reject using that slogan land back altogether. It really sees it as a civil rights issue, that once you have a socialist Canada, then, it's about giving people equal rights and dealing with just as a general problem of racism. And, even anti-revisionist communist projects like the RCP USA have historically treated the problems of the colonized nations of the US as something to be solved within a settler socialist agenda. So as I mentioned earlier, right, forms of settler subjectivity are compelling, just as bourgeois subjectivity is compelling, even for the working class. And when it comes to settlerism, which functions as a racializing ideology in a cross-class manner for those who occupy historic settler positions, it affects this faction of the working class and its movements, perhaps even stronger than bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology, or at least it is bound up within these ideological constellations, right? So the example I gave of Ganasatagi earlier was one in where a lot of working class white people came out angrily against the Mohawk resistance. The same thing happened in Six Nations. Same thing in Wet'suwet'en. I can think about my my dad's side of the family is like very like kind of working class around the auto industry in Oshawa. They have this kind of like idea of like they're pro-union. They have this notion that is kind of like a general social democratic consciousness in some ways. But if you ask them questions about, not all of them, but dominantly, if you ask them questions about indigenous self-determination, then they have like, very backwards views. And so, to be clear, right, that there have been, in the kind of the history of struggle, there have been white working class factions and individuals who were on the correct side of these conflicts, but they were a minority, and were often from unions or job sites that possessed a racially diverse composition. And as I already noted, while settler ideology is compelling and powerful, right, there are always these gaping pores in its flesh and fractures in its skeleton.
Yeah, absolutely. And M posed a question, but you addressed it in real time as you were going through your answers there. So moving on, like you write this piece primarily, right, from a North American context, understandably. And yeah, I mean this connects directly also to what you were just saying as you were talking about sort of the settler left, right? Because this is also an argument that comes up in the context of Palestine from fortunately fewer and fewer people, but people will be like, oh, well, the Israeli Zionist left has to unite with the Palestinian left, right? And then you can get a socialist project coming out of the alignment of these progressive forces, right? And so I think it's a particularly thinking about Palestine right now, which is obvious on a lot of our minds, can also help us to see all of the contradictions that you're laying out even more starkly, even though obviously they still impact us here in North America. So as I wrote in this question, I was like, I know you're in Canada, right? I'm in the US, and the US and the Canadian left are obviously proximate and easy for us to describe these phenomena for folks, and that certainly you as you wrote this piece, right, you wrote it in 2020, 2021, etc., right? There are things that you talk about in the piece, obviously, with regard to COVID and the reactions to that, George Floyd rebellion, and so on. But since October, as you know, many of these contradictions are starkly clear in the Palestinian context, which I'm sure is part of also why it makes sense to include this essay in a conversation about within material around national liberation, settler colonialism, and so on. So how does the Palestinian context and their struggle against the Zionist settler project help us to see these things clearly? And do you think this can help us in bringing clarity to these dynamics here in Turtle Island as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question that is good to engage with. And you noted this issue of material that it was part of, and part of the motivation of this issue of material was for what you're talking about right now, to be about settler colonialism and national resistance in general, and to link up these kinds of commonalities as well as explore differences, right? And what we can learn from Palestine, what we can learn from all these other places historically. I mean, it was important for us, obviously, to address not just Palestine, but these older settler colonial formations. I mean, Alex Lapin's piece, which is like right after mine, like she notes in her analysis how what she's talking about applies to the current conjuncture in Palestine, but her focus is primarily on Canadian and U.S. colonialism and this kind of settler victimhood, right? And so we wanted to tie these things together because they're related, and the issues of the colonial conquest of the past, since they're ongoing, right, are not isolated from each other, even if they have their own unique characteristics. But yeah, I noted in my article many of the contradictions I was originally looking at only in regard to North American colonialism, with maybe Australian and New Zealand colonialism at the back of my mind, because I live in a country on this continent. But those contradictions became patently obvious with Israel's current phase of colonial warfare. So, the way to think about it is this: is that a lot of colonial contradictions in Canada and the U.S. are covered up over this period of time of 500 years, clumsily covered up, but by centuries of ideological maintenance. And that's where this kind of, the settlerism becomes immanent, right? An immanent ideology, an immanent consciousness. We've reached the point, which I note a lot in my essay, that liberals can say their mea culpas about colonialism while also refusing to recognize its ongoing structural implications. In Canada, we had a whole government-sponsored Truth and Reconciliation investigation that the Liberal government sponsored, and they're really big about. We're going to do this Truth and Reconciliation with our First Nations people, but all it ended up resulting in was, the report that the Truth and Reconciliation put out was really good because it was done with people that cared about looking at the truth of the history of colonization. And it was a massive report and outlined all these things. But for the government and for the people around it, it just was enough that report got done. It had a lot of, there was a lot of performative guilt on the part of Canadian civil society about it. They even do now land acknowledgements in public schools, but without actually being interested in decolonization. So there's that. But, at the same time, there was, evidence of genocide in residential schools hit the public consciousness kind of like at the end of lockdown period in Canada. There's the residential school system, which is a vicious part of Canadian colonialism. They were discovering these mass graves, right? This was always known by colonized people and their allies. It wasn't like a basic new discovery. It was actually even part of it was talked about in that giant Truth and Reconciliation report. But suddenly there was this, empirical evidence of it that hit the public consciousness in mainstream newspapers, right? And then there was, again, this outflowing of, oh, guilty us, this is so sad, right? But there was also immediately genocidal denialism in a number of newspapers, right? And people saying it was all made up. It was like opinion articles, tons of opinion articles written about this, like the most horrific genocide denialism you can think about. But no one seemed to. It was just all an issue of free speech, right? Even the liberals who lamented the residential schools didn't care that these newspapers were printing racist genocidal denial. All that mattered was that it was being talked about, and so it didn't have to really matter in a concrete sense. And it's just that the imminent, that's a way that it could still be, even when it's admitted, denial can be permitted, and also there's this refusal to do anything concrete about it. The Canadian colonial state is maintained. A general liberal settlerism becomes the norm, sometimes blossoming into these reactionary settler forms. But the current phase of colonial warfare in Palestine, to my mind, demonstrated that there was an open and undisguised war of colonial genocide, the kind that the US and Canada unapologetically waged in the days of conquest. And that war was regurgitating all the old tropes and practices of the colonial garrison in the most gauche and unrepentant manner. Like open massacres, the murdering of elders and children, complete attrition on the colonial population. But in this situation, the entire political apparatuses of the settler capitalist states and the old imperialist states immediately lined up on the side of Israel, justifying the genocidal war, which shows you what they were always about. Like this was one of their siblings. So it doesn't matter that the liberal and social democratic factions of these political apparatuses shed tears for their colonial past, that they launched Truth and Reconciliation commissions or performatively take the knee on behalf of the George Floyd protests or whatever performative thing they do. Because at the end of the day, they're all on the side of colonial genocide. This is their business, right? Even Canada, we had the situation where we have this left-wing party that's called the New Democratic Party, the NDP. And they're supposed to be the most, the more socially democratic one, the most left. But they, earlier on, they censored one of their MPs, Sarah Jama, for her support of Palestine, right? And really targeted her for like breaking party discipline by openly talking about, like the Palestinian self-determination in Parliament, and that's a supposedly left-wing one. So the clarity here is that the political establishment of these states is pro-colonial. And though they try to bury it in sublimated forms in their own societies with discourses about civility and legal due process, they're very happy at the end of the day to defend colonial genocide. Maybe some of these factions in the political establishment are losing their stomach for this defense, some, right, due to how gross the actions of the Zionist entity have become. Like the NDP that originally, chastised Sarah Jama has now, their leaders are now putting out things that are close to, demands for ceasefire and stuff like that they never would have put out in the fall, right? Because I think it's just becoming, a little bit hard to maintain a support of that, because I think it reminds these political factions of their own of their nation's own history of grossness, but they still couch their distaste in a defense of Israel's right to exist because it has to do with their own right to exist. But another thing, I want to kind of end my discussion on this question with actually a quote from the journal, but not from me, from Abdul Jawad Omar, who you put us in contact with for the interview. He's an amazing writer and analyst, and he gave a really great interview in this issue of Material. And so it's a quote from him. He says, "Today, many in the world are stating outright, I'm a Palestinian too. But we are also the refugees crossing the Mediterranean, the laborers of rural Asian societies, the struggle in India and the Philippines, the cries of all those agonized from the world that remains not theirs, a world that also remains not ours."
Yeah, and I'm so glad that Abdul Jawad, his interview is in the text, in the journal. I'll also just plug for folks that I just in the chat, we have a playlist now because actually I need to there it is. Because we've done 9 conversations with him now, and we'll do the 10th one this coming week, so be on the lookout for that. But also, as you were talking about that, the NDP kind of positions, like, we have the same thing here in the United States. I mean, what you're describing actually almost to a T happened, right? Because Rashida Tlaib, right, is kind of DSA endorsed candidate, so on. She's comes from Palestinian background, not a very radical person, right? Not a very but still within the context of Congress, one of the more quote unquote progressive folks, and obviously, has Palestinian folks that she's accountable to some extent within her family and her community and so on. And, yes, she got censured like right away, just for, I don't even remember exactly what it was. I think just maybe, I'm not even sure if she used the term genocide, but, being opposed to the level of civilian casualties and things like this, right? And that, again, like what you're saying, like the defenses of these things that get offered, even by what is sort of the most left wing, right, within these bourgeois parties, um, is all about like international law and norms and things like this. And even with that, like, in the United States, we have the House passing a bill saying that we should sanction people from the ICC and the ICJ, right, for issuing, these. Actually, I think it was the ICC for the arrest warrants for Netanyahu, right? And so, even within that, it's a very modest kind of like, do you think international law should exist? Because within, most of the United States Congress would say no, like, fuck international law, honestly. We do what we want to do, right? So anyway, yeah, it is kind of, I think that in its own way reveals how institutionalized settler ideology is too, that um like the United States as an entity really doesn't think that it has any accountability to the rest of the world at all, and doesn't think Israel does either, because this is our little settler colonial baby over here, and so yeah. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up. So if people have audience questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. I've made a couple of notes of things that we can follow up on. But, the last important task, right? Because you're not looking at this as it's, the piece is not a pessimism. It's not this is impossible for us to overcome this settler ideology, that this is some structure that is all encompassing, that we all fall into, that we can't break down and struggle against. So what do you see as the path to combating this ideology? As you say in the piece, you don't think this means that all people living on stolen land, or even all white people on stolen land, are irredeemable or shouldn't be organized, or so on. Um, so is this something you think that we have to begin with kind of prefiguratively also in our organizations to combat this ideology among ourselves? Do we need to destroy the material structures of settler colonialism to defeat the basis for this ideology? How might we think about those structures and ideologies that both come out of this, but also reinforce settler colonialism? And what is the pathway, as much as you can describe it in your view, to overcoming this?
Yeah, I mean, I should just say yes to your questions of, destroying the material structures of settler colonialism and prefiguratively combating this ideology. But, but no, because obviously I agree with that. But more definitely needs to be said. I think the problem here is that you're right. I'm not pessimistic. I don't believe that that we just accept situation of oppression and we can't do anything about it and just be, well, that's it. The world's, I mean, I've written before, and I think that on necrocapitalism piece, the idea that nihilism can really, really sink into the left, right? And it's hard not to be nihilistic and pessimistic when you look at the state of the world. But I mean, really, what I was writing was, it was a diagnosis of an ideology. It was kind of like an ideological analysis, right? A diagnosis of an ideology that is intrinsic to the functioning of those capitalist states that are also settler colonial, what I call settler capitalist states. As an individual who's writing a scholarly article investigating this ideology, at most I could say was that this ideology needs to be overcome in any social movement within settler capitalist contexts that seek to be, if these movements seek to be revolutionary. The reason I don't say, any more in that is because, like, one of my main points forever, as in terms of my scholarship and as someone who has, done organizing and activism over, decades, is that I think the only way to truly combat this ideology and the material basis upon which it is built is by building the kind of revolutionary and organized movement that is required in these contexts. And this kind of movement should have this programmatic theory that grows organically with its contact with the masses, that addresses these questions, and does that kind of concrete social investigation that only a collective project can do. And of course, part of that is having a revolutionary plan to attack colonialism along with capitalism. And for a while, I was, part of such a movement before it reached its end due to a number of other internal contradictions, which I'm not going to get into. But one of the things it had was a great analysis of how Canadian capitalism was bound up with settler colonialism, and an approach to the question of national self-determination that attempted to pull in a wide variety of forces. I mean, the project ended, but it taught me a lot, particularly the importance of working with a party program, a set of tactics, a concrete analysis of the concrete situation. So we need both the diagnostic analysis of what needs to be fought and a plan to fight it. But in my opinion, this is something that can only be solved by like a partisan organization invested in organizing in these spaces, specifically organizing with colonized people, right? And seeing them as what we used to call the hardcore of the proletariat, or like, the most oppressed, the most advanced, the people that should be leading the movement and that you find and you learn from. As for prefiguratively combating this ideology, again, that can't be solved on an individual level. Because, that's what I was talking about earlier, about how we are socialized according to dominant ideology. This idea that you as sometimes some individuals can run into things that will individually change their view, but it's easy if you just like kind of exist in that isolated individual manner to fall into the kind of the tropes of dominant ideology. And if you get out, it's a matter of accident sometimes. Or because we end up being collected by an organization that helps us to combat it, right? I've had the honor of being introduced to radical politics by a variety of people and organizations throughout my life, without which, if I hadn't encountered these people, I would have been some kind of liberal, right? I don't know what kind of liberal I'd be. I don't know what that alternate version of Josh is like, but I know that, it was with contact with people that had a history of struggle, people from colonized and racialized backgrounds, people in organizations doing a lot of this kind of work, that if I hadn't been in contact with them over my life, and also, organizing with them, doing activism with them, I would have had very different politics. And so, And so, with that in mind, I think it's like that's why there needs to be strong organizations that just don't rely on people accidentally encountering individuals and small organizations that can mentor them, but like large ones that build a kind of counter hegemony, which is really, this is so hard to do. This is what revolutionary organizing needs to be, but we're very far from that here, right? But having these strong organizations that have that ability to combat an ideology, right, and produce that counter hegemony. So I guess it's kind of maybe a very simplistic thing to say, but the pathway for me, as it has always been, is a revolutionary communist party of some kind that has a concrete analysis of the concrete situation. And for me, this collective subjectivity that these organizations generate means more than any individual consciousness, and can contribute so much more. But, a partisan project that truly addresses the problems of settler capitalism, along with capturing the imagination of the masses, at least in North America, still needs to be built.
Right on. Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to pull to audience questions. So folks, feel free to add yours. There's a couple here. I have a couple things that I wrote down, but M asks, why use the term garrison? The only other person they know that uses this is Daruba. That's Daruba Ben Wahad. He refers to, I know he refers to Israel as a settler, as a garrison state, and I think he calls the United States that as well. So yeah, for you, what's the importance of garrisons?
Well, for me, it was the literature I was reading at the time when I wanted to examine settlerism. I hadn't read that. That's interesting. But it was like when I was reading these histories, when I was reading like the historiography of conquest, right? And the way that they talked about, the way that the colonizers spoke about themselves, saw themselves, and the way it was described by these historians, they spoke about these as being garrisons. It was like, this is a garrison. This is a garrison village. Like they were actually referring, that's why I brought up that history. They're referring to it in concrete terms. So I was kind of connecting it to that notion, that ongoing notion. Also, that idea of the settler garrison appeared in Settlers by Sakai as well, when he was talking about settlerism. So it just made organic sense to use it as linking together with that thing. And also really got to what I wanted to explain about that kind of the paramilitary function that emerges in situations of colonial resistance, that it's just a callback and is on that continuum with the actual concrete garrison as it was called and known back in the days of conquest.
Yeah, right on. And there's a linkage there, because Sakai was very much in relation to prisoner movements that were associated with the New African Prisoners Organization, and they were very much, as they said themselves, like on a continuum of kind of elaborating a lot of the theoretical work that the BLA began. And so Daruba obviously was the primary theorist within the Black Liberation Army. And so there's, it'd be interesting if we could get Daruba actually to talk about that a little bit. I would be interested in that because, there's obviously James Yaqui Sales as well. And so there's this set of folks that were political prisoners for a time, some of them social prisoners that became politicized. And Sakai very much was in dialogue with those folks too, as was like Butch Lee and others, right? And so their work is, I mean, even if you look at like the work of Sanyika Shakur, he actually will cite them all kind of together as a part of the development of the new African communists tradition, essentially, as all part of it, right? And so there is a connection there as well. So let's see. So this is another question from M. So settler left is largely only taken as the original white population who moved here. How does the immigrant population play into this? Can this be seen as a secularization project of the settler colonial project?
Yeah, I mean, this is why it's important for me to discuss it as the as an ideology that generates subject positions. And of course, those that have the most material investment in settler colonialism are going to be affected by it the most. But because it's this dominant ideology, it can affect everyone, even people moving here, right? There is, a tendency when people are talking about settlers and things like that to refer to immigrants as arrivants instead, because a lot of times, a lot of immigrants who come is because of imperialism, and they're pushed out of their original places. And I think but I mean, it's more complex than that, right? I mean, there is a truth to that, because there are people who are arrivants that wouldn't want to be here anyway, right? They would rather be back in their homeland, but it's like a war zone, and because of like oppression and imperialism and other forms of colonialism, like in Palestine, they fled, right? My wife's family came here because they were already pushed out of Palestine because of the Nakba, and then had to leave Lebanon after being in refugee camps in Lebanon. Had to leave because of the civil war there, right? And I know my wife's grandfather once said that the only reason he came to Canada because it was as far as he could get from Lebanon, right? So there's that, right? So people that come there, and I think you got to trace. It's doing a concrete analysis of all these different places, right? So there's people drawn to settler colonialism because of their investment in the white supremacy of colonialism, right? And then there's people that come here. They may have not had good politics where they left. There's even arrivants that come here for opportunistic reasons, not because they're pushed out because of war, right? And based on their social class positions, they gravitate to different ideologies, right? And so you can find people. There are people that come here as immigrants that actually get really wholly invested in a settler subjectivity and how cool Canada is I'm talking about Canada as great, and then they end up in the Conservative Party and things like that, right? Or the Liberals, right? And then there's others who come whose consciousness is such because of what they've experienced that when they see Indigenous resistance here, they feel drawn to that, right? So it really just comes down. It's a hard. That's why like talking about it as an ideology that generates multiple subject positions, because part of the job of organizing is like when you're organizing with communities is to find out what people's like dominant ideology subject positions is. So who's your friend and who's your enemy in these kind of places.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it can get us beyond kind of like identity reductionist sort of versions of talking about these things, right? And Charles asked a question here, obviously, that is related, is very much similar, but talking about enslaved African population, right? Comes here. Obviously, they're not settlers in an initial, sense and all. But the question is asked, do slaves become settlers if they become presidents, right? So we could talk about Barack Obama. And, again, I think you probably answer this similarly in saying that it has to do with their ideology and how they construct their own subjectivity. But yeah, do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, it's what I want to say is that we're talking about it as like this kind of immanentized ideology, as opposed to like people coming over and settling as part of conquest, which that happened, right? As the conquest happened, now we have the ongoing event of settler colonialism post the initial conquest, right? Which brings in all of these complexities. And so it's for me, it's more not saying this person is a settler and this isn't. We can say that, right? But it's more saying like, what is the do they have a settlerist subject position, right? How are they invested in that? What is their material relationship to that? Now, when it comes to like the enslaved populations, which the U.S. has, Canada has a history with Black slavery, but not at the same level that the U.S. does. It didn't have that plantocracy that the U.S. has. But that whole, I wouldn't even like refer to that as arrivants, because this is like people that were stolen, right? The enslaved population, that was I see that as part of colonialism and national struggle. And so that the large the consciousness of people that were stolen as part of the colonial project and put into the nightmare world of the plantocracy are on the same kind of wavelength generally as resistant Indigenous populations. Of course, there's contradictions between these communities, and that's a matter of history and all that sort of thing, as there is. But it's like to say, would they be a settler? Not as asking if an Indigenous person can have a settler consciousness. And yes, some people, there's compradors. There's people that sell out their colonized communities and side with the settlers as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. So Joe, Joe asks, are settlers interpolated by a desire to be a part of the dominant class and or a fear of ending up in the subordinate class? Are settlers conscious subjects in this sense? Does that even matter? Is this kind of Foucauldian, Althusserian analysis even appropriate?
Can you throw the first part of that question up again so I can just, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, yeah.
Just I gotta
So,
think through that when I'm responding to it here.
yeah, no worries.
Um, yeah, well, first of all, it's like tracing out the forms of interpolation and the way people are hailed to be settlers. I think it's different. That's why like I think there's like different settler subject positions, right? That people are interpolated in different ways, right? I talk about kind of the liberal one, the reactionary one, and I think the reactionary one is definitely that cross class is still due to be part of this kind of dominant class and maintain power. And there's because a lot of reactionary kind of fascist subjects, they have this fear. It's, this the kind of racist fear that's cultivated by reactionary things, that they're going to be like there's some kind of white genocide going on or something like that. And so this desire to hold on to the gross forms of colonial power is part of how they become a very specific type of settler subject, right? But there's other settler subjects who, like, it may at one point be connected to this kind of idea of like their material investment, right? Because I think that's important, right? This material investment in some ways, but it's become so much common sense, the way that you learn what your state is, and all of the kind of like massive kind of propaganda points that this land is the best because of XYZ and things like that, that is kind of inherited as it becomes part of the way the air people breathe, and they just kind of like just absorb that kind of thing. And I think there's people, we talked about arrivants who get drawn to, because it's such a dominant ideology, get drawn to the settler colonial ideology. It's not because they just think that's the way that's the way Canada is presented to them. There's an entire immigration process Canada has. I'm sure the U.S. has it too, but I've seen all the Canadian propaganda about it, where all these people are like, oh, we're so bad in our country, but Canada is so great here, and it's all multicultural, and all of that is part of not talking about the colonial past, right? So people could be drawn to it as part of their desire to be part of like the social whole, and then be part of like common sense ideology and those kinds of things. And that's why I think it's like I don't think you can trace it to like one very specific type of interpolation, right? I think that because the reason why I want to talk about it is immanent, because that kind of common sense, structural, institutionalized ways, there's all these forms that people are hailed into becoming settler colonial subjects that happens from the moment you start getting socialized.
Yeah, right on. And I took a note. Yeah, I mean, even as you're talking about like a good example of this in my mind is the Woody Guthrie song, "This Land Is Your Land, This Land Is My Land," right? Which is Woody Guthrie's radical, he's a left-wing person in general, right? But like that song is still a manifestation of a settler consciousness or settler ideology that doesn't even engage with the idea that indigenous people existed, and like maybe at least some of it shouldn't be our land. Like, and I mean, I guess we could talk about that too in the context of something that Em asked earlier, which you kind of did pose, right? But there's people who will say that when we reach socialism, settler colonialism is automatically resolved because they pose it only as a land question. And then they say, well, the land would be collectivized or whatever else, and so kind of the bourgeois property relations, right, wouldn't matter as much. What do you say about that part?
I think this is like one that has been largely talked about by the radical movement historically, and it's one that this idea of the national question being important, and people saying, well, let's ignore it, socialism will resolve that, was already rejected way back in the early 20th century by the Third International. You have an entire debate in the Second Congress of the Third International about this, and the resolution is that national self-determination for colonized and oppressed peoples is like, it has to happen in any socialist project, right? And that they have the autonomy to struggle for their national self-determination. And this is like this was, put out in like, I think what, 1916 or something like that, or maybe earlier. And then you have people writing about this over and over, like Mary Tiggy writes about it, Ibrahim Kabakaya writes about it, Lenin wrote about it, right? So I think that this idea that, that socialism is going to solve it is something that, people already argued against, and we have that history. Now, the reason why they said it wouldn't solve it is because if there's people that are fighting for their culture and their community and their meaning as a people, as a nation, then that matters. That history is a living history that they should have the right to pursue without being impeded by by people that are oppressing them, right? And the idea that you would get socialism by just you have the socialist movement. Like, what are you going to do when there's people that are like, okay, but I want to live with not underneath this kind of like colonial cultural apparatus that was imposed on me? Like, what do you do then? In order to maintain it, there ends up still being situations of oppression, right? And ends up being a little bit pie in the sky to thinking a socialist movement can solve that, because any socialist movement worth its salt is going to have in situations of colonialism, the colonized people on your side, because they're going to have the most like revolutionary subjectivities because they don't like the system as it is, right? And if you're not getting them on your side, are you even going to get socialism to begin with, right? It becomes really difficult to think that through.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I agree. So let's see, a couple more questions. So would it be beneficial to do more to frame the struggle against settler colonialism within the lens of internationalism? Do you see that as easier, quote unquote?
Ooh, I don't know what would make anything easier, but I think it's definitely, I think it's obviously important to frame the struggle against settler colonialism within the lens of internationalism, for sure, because colonized people all around the world have their own nations. So we're dealing with internationalism altogether, right? And of course, internationalism was so important for struggles against colonialism in the history of the last like great revolutionary period in history, right? When you find all these kind of different colonized nations making links with each other, supporting each other, that sort of thing. So I definitely, I don't know about it's easier or harder, but I think it's necessary. And it's also necessary in the way we analyze colonialism is not some internal civil rights problem, but it's a problem of like parasitical nations on top of colonized nations. Like one of my friends and colleagues, Tyler Shipley, he wrote this long history of Canada. It's a radical social history of Canada. And the way he frames it from the beginning is he frames it as in terms of foreign relations, because he's like, it's not the problem of colonialism in Canada it's not about this internal colonies. It begins with this conquest as an example of violent foreign relations with other nations, right? And so for him, colonialism is internationalism of negative internationalism, right? It's a bunch of nations going out internationally and they have their own internationalism, all these European states, right? And so of course it's necessary to have kind of frame this struggle against settler colonialism as one of internationalism too.
Yeah, right on. When this was a response to Woody Guthrie, but when Woody Guthrie wrote that song, this person writes, "My grandparents weren't legally citizens," right? And so, yeah, I mean, very, very problematic.
Yeah, I mean
formulation.
that song would only be like a good song if it was written in like a non-settler colonial context. I mean, the moment it's
Right.
written in a settler colonial context, it automatically brings that issue into it, right?
Yeah. Um. All right. So I'm gonna ask another one here, and there's a couple more from the audience. I appreciate all the engagement today, folks. I do have to run out when we get to in about 20 minutes or so, but um, so one of the things that gets brought up, and gets brought up by the groups you mentioned earlier, which are always fun to talk about a little bit, but the Patriot Socialists and the MAGA communists will bring up this point, and I have a sense of how I think you'll respond to this, and we may have even talked about this before, but one of the things that gets trotted out is, well, Marx said the American Revolution was good, that it was progressive, right? And he thought that the Union was good in the Civil War, and so therefore, the Union as it exists today, the United States, is still a progressive force that we should build off of, right, in order to move toward socialism. And so again, I have a sense of how you respond to that, but it is something that people might hear. So how would you respond to that?
Oh, I just think that's like mindless dogmatism. I mean, I don't care what things Marx and Engels said in certain books. I can care more about their method in doing a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. They themselves said they could get things wrong, and they did get things wrong. So, I mean, everyone is, this is actually the most Marxian concept, is to say that we are, these uh, that we are made by history. We make history. Marx begins with this in his analysis of Louis Bonaparte, the Little, and he talks about, humans make history, but not as they please, but in circumstances directly encountered from the past. And that means that your whole understanding is, no matter how much you can get out of that box, you still are stuck with the materials you have and the way you analyze and go about doing things. And I think that things Marx and Engels got wrong is because they're limited to the information they get from like the British press. They can be like critical of it all they want, but they're also reading it in certain kinds of ways. Plus, Marx and Engels always saw the French Revolution as more revolutionary than the American one. They referred to it much more, right? They thought that the American Revolution was a bourgeois revolution, but that was based on the way that the American Revolution, the French Revolution happened around the same time, and the relationship. But even eventually, Thomas Paine and folks like that thought the French Revolution was too radical. And other people have written about how it wasn't like a bourgeois revolution, that if there was a the bourgeois revolution in America would have been in the Civil War or something like that. And that's another issue for historians to consider. But the fact is that kind of analysis that, they said they liked this or they liked that, doesn't take into account how people who have historical materialist analyses since Marx and Engels and have had access to the material and the archives and the concrete analysis that Marx and Engels didn't have written about it since then, right? And we have, lots of people that have written about what the American Revolution was, who are very, very, good historians, right? Talking about it being a counter-revolution, right? That's what Gerald Horne calls it, right? Or even had like Samir Amin he would say like, there's these great world historical revolutions. The American one doesn't count because it's just a bunch of slave owners that wanted, from a settler colony that wanted to like have the property for themselves, right? And that's one of the great historical materialists of the theory of imperialism. So you have all of this stuff. So going back to some guys in the 19th century who, whatever their importance for me as a Marxist, which the importance, but suddenly saying that their historical analysis is better just because they're Marx and Engels, that's not even historical materialism. That's dogmatism.
Right on. Definitely is. Yeah, Colin, I think we addressed this question regarding, the question of, this is a question of national liberation and autonomy, right? And so, yeah, I think we did get to that one. Chantal asks, in what ways does reconciliation function as a part of settlerism ideology? This may have been addressed, but, missed a part of it. But yeah, talk about that a little bit, about reconciliation, and how that functions within settler societies. Canada obviously has a more, United States, we don't really even have any kind of reconciliation, but in Canada you do.
Yeah, I mean, I did mention this earlier in the questions, but I can just go back over that again. I kind of talked about how a certain type of like liberal settlerism is able to kind of like assuage its guilty conscience by like this reconciliation discourse. I mean, it's not really like reconciliation is ever happening. In order for there to be real reconciliation, you have to have decolonization. So the moment that it's put as in, this is something Canada can reconcile with its First Nation peoples. This is usually the discourse it puts out. Not that they're separate nations, not that this issue is national self-determination. We can reconcile by like bringing out all this past, doing an investigation of it, and like apologizing or something, right? We can say this was originally the land of this or that people in land acknowledgements, right? Which is all just a way to assuage colonial guilt. There's no real reconciliation happening. There's not even within the civil rights framework do you see a real reconciliation happening, right? You don't see any kind of reparations. You don't see like to people who still are like, reparations for people that have, been eviscerated by the history of colonialism and, the land that they're on being like pushed into like reserves Bantustan structures. Nothing dealing with that. You don't see the Canadian state saying, oh, if we really want to reconcile, maybe we'll be okay. Maybe we'll rethink putting a pipeline through indigenous land, right? They don't do that. Everything goes on. All it is just like, we'll write a report, and it's a good report, and the people involved in it were good, and they wanted actual reconciliation to happening. But we'll write this report, and then we'll shake hands with some, public figures, and go to some ceremonies, and just apologize and feel guilty. And when things are uncovered that are these grim realities of our past, we'll make a national day for it or something like that. All recognition is important, right? But it's not. It's all this forms of like a colonial recognition. I think Glenn Scott Coulthard has talked a lot about that kind of that, the way that recognition functions in Canadian discourse, the liberal Canadian discourse, and its colonial aspects. So it's really worth reading him on that. I see his book behind you, actually.
Yeah, that was intentional, and Laura Brarian shouted out Coulthard right before you mentioned that too. So yeah, absolutely. All right. I think, let's see. Oh, well, this is just a random question. You might be able to answer. It was for the whole audience, but do you have any recommendations on reading about the French Revolution?
Oh man, if you'd asked me this 10 years ago, I would have, but like I just can't think right now about.
Yeah, it's all good.
It's not. I'm not. My area is not like. Even though I have to study a lot of history, I'm not like a historian, right?
Right. Yeah. That's great.
I'd say Black Jacobins.
Black Jacobins. Yeah, no, that is actually a good
because
history.
it happens during the French
Yeah.
Revolution, and it does describe things that are going on, but the center of
Yeah.
focus is Haiti, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's the best book on the French Revolution that I've read, because it deals with it also in this dialectic between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, and you get it. I mean, that book is intense too, by the way. Like I think when I first started reading it, I didn't expect, like, TLR James really digs into like all of these different, factions and, groups and how they align themselves and stuff like that. It's really a great book. Before we let you go, I don't know if you defined this earlier on, but it is part of your piece too, and you've mentioned it a few times. But when you say settler capitalism, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I got this term. So I borrowed this term from Tyler Shipley, although he might have gotten it from someone else. I can't remember in his book. But it's a way that he talks about like capitalist social formations that also developed through settler colonialism, right? So it's like, he's trying to look at the way to do that is trying to look at how these kind of how colonialism and settler colonialism is interbound with capitalist social relations. And on some level of world capitalism, at some point, like all settler colonialism was connected to the rise of capitalism. But if the idea is to look at these remaining like settler states, as also being capitalist nation states that have imperialist projects externally, and that there's this relationship between their settlerism and their imperialism. Because it's like Britain is not a settler capitalist state, doesn't have internal settler colonies. It's an imperialist state, has a history of being part of colonialism, but it doesn't have these kind of maintaining like control over subject populations within Britain itself, right? A lot of these European states don't have it. So it's a way to look at how these capitalist social formations that still have settler colonies that didn't disappear when they separated from the motherlands of Europe, but they still have this kind of settler basis.
Yeah, right on. And a shout out to Ali Kadri too. I know that hopefully we're gonna do something with him again soon. Yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate the conversation today. Is there anything else you wanted to say in closing? I definitely encourage people, go on to the Foreign Languages Press website and order a copy of the journal. Check it out. Support the work of FLP, because it's a really important press, and I know that they keep everything priced like at a bare minimum, and I don't think anybody gets paid off of the work that they do. It's just really a political project, and so it's an important one to support.
Yep, I got nothing else to say.
All
Support
right,
FLP.
right on. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll see if we can get Ali Kadri a good mic. Yeah. Maybe we can get Sina Rahmani to do that. He sends mics to people around the world to improve the quality of their work. So anyway, appreciate everybody. Again, make sure to share this video with folks. I've really enjoyed the conversation today, JMP. I think that is really helpful and useful for us to think about this, to have an international analysis of settler colonialism and settlerism, and to be able to think about it in our own context as well. Obviously, as in the war that's on all of our minds, that we're all struggling in ways that we can right now, to support Palestinian people in their liberation struggle and against genocide. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.